April 1864. The sun rose over the Mississippi River, casting long gold streaks across the muddy bluffs above Fort Pillow. Inside the earthen walls, Union soldiers moved with a nervous rhythm, checking rifles, adjusting cartridge boxes, whispering prayers. Most were black men, former slaves wearing the blue for the first time, members of the 6th U.S. Colored Heavy Artillery. Around them, the air was heavy with gunpowder and disbelief. Nathan Bedford Forrest's Confederate cavalry had surrounded the fort before dawn. The garrison's white commander promised that the flag would never fall. But every man inside the fort already knew the truth. If they lost, mercy would not come. By mid-afternoon, the fort's defenses collapsed. The men of the 6th fired until their barrels steamed and their ammunition ran out. Some dropped their rifles and raised their hands. Others stood fast. Then came the silence, brief, unnatural, followed by the sound of gunfire resuming. Witnesses said the shooting continued long after the white flag went up. Black soldiers were hunted down in the trenches, shot, clubbed, or burned alive. When the smoke cleared, bodies lay scattered across the slope, their blue coats dark with blood. More than half the black garrison was dead. Forrest's men called it victory. Washington called it murder. What happened that day wasn't an accident of rage or chaos. It was the direct result of policy, a policy born of fear. The Confederacy had already declared that any black man in Union uniform would not be treated as a prisoner of war, but as a slave in rebellion. Surrender meant execution or chains. So when black soldiers fought, they fought with a knowledge that reshaped the nature of courage itself. Every battle became a last stand, every volley a declaration of humanity. The massacre at Fort Pillow didn't break them, it hardened them. From that day forward, black Union troops carried one truth into every fight. The enemy would take no prisoners, and therefore neither would fear. In December 1862, Jefferson Davis signed an order that changed the moral geometry of the war. It was short, cold, and absolute. Any captured black man found in Union uniform, the proclamation declared, was not a soldier, but a slave in rebellion. He would not be entitled to the protections of the laws of war, nor to exchange, nor to mercy. His white officers, deemed traitors for arming the enslaved, would be hanged. With that stroke of the pen, the Confederacy drew a line that separated this war from all others. It became not only a struggle for territory, but a struggle over who counted as human. The Confederate government's logic was ruthless but consistent. To recognize a black man as a lawful combatant was to acknowledge his equality, and equality was a death sentence for slavery itself. The sight of black soldiers in blue uniforms, armed, disciplined, marching under the stars and stripes, was an existential threat. Southern newspapers raged that it was a war of servile insurrection under federal command. Generals called it monstrous. The Richmond Examiner warned that the Union's use of black troops would open the gates of hell upon the South. So when the Emancipation Proclamation took effect on January 1, 1863, freeing enslaved people in the rebel states and authorizing their enlistment in the Union Army, the Confederate response was swift and brutal. Davis's order was followed by local instructions to field commanders. Captured black soldiers were to be returned to their rightful owners or executed. Officers like General Edmund Kirby Smith in the Trans-Mississippi Theater echoed the sentiment with chilling precision. No quarter will be given to armed Negroes. On paper, it looked like bureaucratic rage. In practice, it created a racial extermination policy that would play out on battlefields from Louisiana to Tennessee. Confederate soldiers needed little encouragement. Many saw themselves not as fighting another army, but as putting down an uprising. A captured black soldier was not a prisoner of war. He was a runaway slave who had taken up arms against his master. That was rebellion in its purest form. and rebellion, under Southern law, merited death. In private correspondence, Confederate officers admitted the fear beneath their fury. They worried what would happen if the enslaved masses believed the Union's promise of freedom. A colonel in Mississippi wrote, "Every Negro with a musket threatens the safety of every white woman in the South." The panic was cultural as much as military. Armed black men contradicted centuries of ideology in a single image. They weren't supposed to stand straight. They weren't supposed to fight back. Union leaders understood the stakes. When Lincoln approved the formation of the Bureau for Colored Troops in May 1863, he knew he was igniting something larger than manpower policy. "If they stake their lives for us," he said, "they must be prompted by the strongest motive, even the promise of freedom. And the promise being made must be kept." He was right, but he also knew what it meant. Every black regiment raised under that promise would be marching into a war where capture could mean the noose. The first test came quickly. Reports from battlefields along the Mississippi told of Confederate units refusing to take prisoners when black soldiers were involved. At Port Hudson, Louisiana, in May 1863, captured black troops were summarily shot. At Yazoo City, a Confederate officer wrote that the Negroes fought well, but we gave them no quarter. These were not isolated incidents. They were the visible enforcement of Davis's decree. Even Confederate soldiers began to question the implications. A lieutenant from Texas recorded in his diary after one such engagement, "We killed every Negro that we could find. It was horrible, but the men would have it so." The policy had become a habit. A massacre didn't need orders anymore. It needed only permission. And yet, on the other side of the lines, something remarkable happened. The men who faced this terror refused to be cowed by it. Letters from early recruits in the 1st and 2nd Louisiana Native Guards reveal an awareness of the stakes that bordered on fatalism. "If they take me," one wrote, "they will hang me. So I will fight till I can fight no more." This was the crucible that forged the black soldiers' defiance. The Confederate government's policy of no mercy had unintended consequences. It produced opponents who could not surrender. Every musket they lifted was a rejection of the entire Southern social order. Every shot fired was an act of emancipation. By the end of 1863, word had spread through the camps of the U.S. Colored troops. Surrender was suicide. There would be no exchange, no mercy, no middle ground. It was all or nothing. The Confederacy's attempt to deny their humanity had given them a terrible clarity. They were fighting not to be soldiers. They were fighting to be men. And in that grim logic, the war changed. June 1863. The Mississippi River shimmered like molten glass under the morning sun as musket smoke rolled over the levee at Milliken's Bend. The Union camp there, little more than a cluster of earthen ditches and tents, was held by some of the newest soldiers in the Federal Army. Black men, most of them barely trained, many of them only months removed from the plantations that surrounded the river. They carried old Belgian muskets that misfired in the damp heat and wore uniforms 2 sizes too large. But when the Confederate infantry charged across the fields that day, those men did something their enemy never expected. They stood and fought. Milliken's Bend was not supposed to be a major battle. It was a supply outpost, guarding the Union's lifeline to General Grant's forces besieging Vicksburg. But for the newly raised regiments of the African Brigade, black soldiers commanded by white officers, it became a trial by fire. Before dawn on June 7, 1863, about 2,500 Confederate troops from Walker's Texas Division stormed their lines, expecting an easy rout. What they met instead was desperation turned into discipline. The fighting collapsed into chaos almost immediately. The men of the 9th Louisiana, colored, fired a single volley before the Texans broke through their breastworks. From that moment, the battle became a hand-to-hand nightmare. Men fought with bayonets, musket stocks, even fists. A Union officer later wrote, "It was not war, it was butchery, but our men gave blow for blow." Some of the black soldiers were so new to military life, they couldn't perform a proper drill. Yet they fought with a ferocity that stunned their attackers. When their ammunition ran out, they clubbed their rifles until the barrels bent. Accounts from Confederate survivors are filled with astonishment and unease. One officer admitted that the Negroes fought like demons, refusing to break even when surrounded. But Confederate fury was not merely military, it was ideological. When the tide turned against them, they began executing wounded black soldiers rather than taking them prisoner. A Union gunboat anchored in the river, the Choctaw, fired broadside after broadside into the Confederate lines, saving what remained of the Union force. By noon, the attackers withdrew, leaving the field strewn with bodies. Of roughly 1,000 black troops engaged, nearly half were killed or wounded. Yet Milliken's Bend was a strategic victory. It proved, in the starkest possible terms, that black soldiers would fight. They had not broken. They had bled. And that fact carried all the way to Washington. In the days that followed, newspaper correspondents reported the story with astonishment. The New York Times called it the most extraordinary engagement of the war. General Grant himself, initially skeptical of using black troops in combat, wrote afterward that they had displayed coolness and bravery equal to any veteran soldiers. Lincoln received the reports in silence, then told a visiting congressman, "If they can fight for the Union can fight for them." But the men who survived Milliken's Bend needed no politicians' praise to understand what they had proven. They knew what would happen if they were captured. Jefferson Davis's decree had already circulated widely. Confederate officers made no secret of their intentions. The survivors of the battle spoke of comrades executed after falling wounded, shot where they lay. "We will not be taken alive," became a refrain whispered around the campfires of the new U.S. colored troops. The experience forged a grim clarity. The black soldiers' courage was not built on abstract patriotism. It was built on the knowledge that surrender was death. For men who had once lived under the lash, that truth carried a terrible symmetry. In slavery, submission meant survival. In freedom, it meant annihilation. Training camps across the Mississippi Valley began filling with new recruits, drawn by the example of Milliken's Bend. In June 1863, only about 50,000 black men wore Union blue. By the end of the year, there were over 100,000. Officers noticed a shift in spirit. "They have learned," wrote Colonel John Eaton, who oversaw recruitment of freedmen, "that they are soldiers by right, not by sufferance." The Confederate press dismissed the victory as propaganda, but the damage was done. Milliken's Bend had cracked the myth that black men could not fight as soldiers. For the Union, it was more than a tactical success. It was a moral revelation. These men, once counted as property, had proven themselves the equal of any fighting force in the field. The battle's legacy rippled outward. In letters home, Northern soldiers spoke with newfound respect for their black comrades. Freedmen flocked to enlist, sometimes walking 50 miles barefoot, just for the chance to fight for the flag. The Union had discovered a new army within its own cause. Milliken's Bend was their baptism by fire, a brutal initiation that burned away the last illusions of the old world. The Confederacy had hoped to frighten them into submission. Instead, it taught them a truth that would echo through every battlefield that followed. If surrender meant slavery, then resistance, no matter the cost, was freedom itself. April 12, 1864. The morning began with bugle calls and ended in blood. Fort Pillow sat on a bluff above the Mississippi River, a modest earthwork garrisoned by about 600 Union troops, roughly half of them black men from the 6th U.S. Colored Heavy Artillery and the 2nd U.S. Colored Light Artillery. Their commander, Major Lionel Booth was a white officer who believed his position secure. But by dawn, the fort was surrounded by nearly 2,000 Confederate cavalry under Major General Nathan Bedford Forrest, a man whose name was already whispered with awe and dread. Forrest's demand for surrender arrived mid-morning. The reply came back defiant. "I will not surrender." The Confederates charged. Their first wave broke under fire, but by early afternoon, Forrest's men had outflanked the position, driving the defenders into the inner works. Ammunition ran low, bodies filled the trenches, and the Union line folded inward like a wounded animal. When a white flag went up above the ramparts, the battle should have ended. It didn't. What happened next would become one of the most infamous events of the Civil War. Confederate troops swarmed the fort, shooting, bayoneting, and clubbing men who had already thrown down their weapons. Witnesses, both Union survivors and Confederate soldiers, later described scenes of horror that defied military explanation. Wounded men were dragged out of tents and executed. Some were shot in the river as they tried to swim away. Others were burned alive inside the barracks. When it was over, of the roughly 300 black soldiers in the fort, more than 200 were dead. Forrest's official report described it as a brilliant victory. But the U.S. congressional investigation that followed used another word: massacre. The physical evidence left no doubt. The dead were found with hands raised, bullets in their backs. One Confederate soldier later admitted, "It was a scene of slaughter that I pray to God I may never witness again." Fort Pillow was not the first time Confederate troops had killed surrendering black soldiers, but it was the first time the entire country was forced to face it. News of the massacre raced through the Union lines and Northern newspapers. Harper's Weekly published illustrations of the burning fort, under the headline, "Remember Fort Pillow," a phrase that would become both rallying cry and curse. The response inside the camps of the U.S. colored troops was instantaneous and personal. Letters from soldiers in the 1st and 6th USCT show rage sharpened into resolve. "We will show no mercy," one wrote. "We will never surrender." They had always known what capture meant, but now they had proof. Fort Pillow confirmed that the Confederacy's war against black soldiers was not about military victory, but annihilation. Northern outrage reached Washington. Lincoln, furious and cautious, demanded an inquiry. General Ulysses S. Grant ordered reports collected from witnesses. The findings confirmed what the black regiments already understood. The Confederacy would not recognize them as soldiers, only as slaves to be exterminated. The Union government stopped prisoner exchanges until the South agreed to treat black soldiers as lawful combatants. The war's moral boundaries hardened. For the Confederates, Fort Pillow was meant to send a message. It did, but not the one they intended. Instead of terrorizing black troops into submission, it convinced them that surrender was no longer an option. They would fight to the last cartridge, the last breath, because there was no such thing as survival under the enemy's mercy. From that point on, every engagement involving the USCT carried a new kind of intensity. At the Battle of Tupelo, at the Crater, at Olustee, white Union officers wrote of black troops fighting like men possessed. The cry, "Remember Fort Pillow," echoed across battlefield, shouted as both defiance and vengeance. Confederate soldiers soon learned that the men they once dismissed as cowards would now meet them with unrelenting ferocity. Fort Pillow also marked a turning point in the Union's understanding of what the war had become. Before, it was a conflict over Union and rebellion. After Fort Pillow, it was a conflict over civilization and barbarism. The massacre exposed, in one terrible afternoon, the truth that lay beneath the Confederate cause. It wasn't just about independence. It was about the right to deny humanity itself. In the smoky aftermath, as Union recovery crews buried the dead, one officer wrote, "They died not as slaves, but as soldiers." It was a simple sentence, But it captured the moral transformation of the war. The men at Fort Pillow had been denied the dignity of prisoners, but in death they won something greater, the recognition that their fight was not only for the Union's survival, but for the meaning of freedom itself. After Fort Pillow, every black soldier in blue carried two enemies into battle, the one in front of his rifle and the one that still lived in the nation's heart. They had seen what awaited them if they lost, so they resolved never to lose again. By the summer of 1864, the men of the U.S. colored troops had learned a grim truth written in blood from Mississippi to Tennessee. Surrender was suicide. Fort Pillow had made that certain. From that moment on, every engagement they entered carried an unspoken code. No quarter asked, none expected. Letters from the camps revealed the transformation clearly. "If they take me, they will kill me," wrote a sergeant of the 5th USCT. "So I mean to kill them first." It wasn't bravado. It was math. Confederate policy left no alternative but resistance to the end. Outnumbered, often undersupplied, and facing an enemy that refused to recognize them as soldiers, these men fought with a kind of stripped-down clarity. If they were to live, it would be by their own will alone. At Olustee, Florida, in February 1864, that reality was tested again. The Union's goal was simple: disrupt Confederate supply lines and bring Florida back under federal control. The battle that unfolded in the pine forests west of Jacksonville became a slaughter. Out of roughly 5,500 Union troops, nearly 1,100 were killed, wounded, or missing, many of them from the black regiments. When Confederate troops overran the lines, they shot wounded black soldiers on the ground. Survivors reported seeing prisoners bayoneted or beaten to death with rifle butts. White Union soldiers captured beside them were spared. A corporal from the 54th Massachusetts, the same regiment that had charged Fort Wagner the year before, later described what they all understood after Olustee: "We are fighting a different war than the whites." And they were. Their enemy wasn't just the Confederate Army. It was the idea of racial hierarchy armed with muskets. When news of the massacre reached the Northern press, outrage mingled with admiration. Even as their lines collapsed, the black regiments had held long enough to cover the retreat of the white units. They were the last to fall back, the last to fire. That pattern would repeat again and again across the South. Commanders learned that if they needed a line to hold under impossible odds, they called for the USCT. It wasn't only courage, it was calculation. The black soldiers' will to fight was reinforced by a psychological reality unique to them. They knew the cost of capture, and they refused to pay it. The Confederacy had made them outlaws by decree, and outlaws don't surrender. That mindset, equal parts defiance and survival, turned the USCT into one of the most determined fighting forces of the war. Nowhere was this more evident than at Petersburg, Virginia, in July 1864, during the infamous Battle of the Crater. Union engineers had dug a massive tunnel beneath the Confederate lines and packed it with explosives. When it detonated on July 30th, it tore a hole 170 feet long and 30 feet deep in the Southern defenses. The plan was for white regiments to charge through the breach, but confusion and racism changed the order at the last minute. The black troops, trained specifically for the assault, were held back until the initial attack collapsed. Then, they were sent in to salvage the disaster. They advanced into a pit of fire. Confederate artillery turned the crater into a killing ground. As the battle degenerated into close combat, cries of "No quarter to the Black Yankees" filled the air. Confederate troops bayoneted wounded black soldiers and shot them in groups after they tried to surrender. Still, the USCT fought on. A Confederate officer later admitted, "They fought like fiends. No quarter was asked or given." When survivors straggled back to Union lines, covered in smoke and mud, the sight changed perception. White soldiers who had doubted their valor no longer did. An officer from the 48th Pennsylvania wrote home, "They fought with desperation. For them, there was no choice." The Confederacy's terror campaign had created its own nemesis, a soldier who no longer feared death because he'd already seen what lay on the other side of defeat. The same policy meant to keep black men subservient had instead produced warriors who fought with a ferocity the South could neither predict nor match. In the months after Petersburg, Confederate officers began warning their troops to brace for savage resistance whenever black regiments were present. The USCT had become a force that fought beyond conventional logic, driven not by orders or strategy, but by the primal understanding that they were fighting for the right to exist as free men. Union generals noticed, too. Reports praised their stubborn courage and discipline under fire. General James H. Wilson wrote that, "The black troops fight with a steadiness born of knowledge. They know capture means death. That knowledge bound them together in a brotherhood that transcended color or state. They weren't just soldiers anymore. They were living evidence that freedom was something worth dying for." Every volley they fired carried the same unspoken declaration: if we cannot live as free men, we will die as soldiers. By the fall of 1864, the United States colored troops were no longer experimental units or political symbols. They were the backbone of the Union's advance, and every man who took up a rifle knew the code carved into their history. Surrender was not an option. They had learned the lesson of Fort Pillow. They had lived it at Olustee. They had carried it through the crater. It was their grim inheritance and their greatest strength, the understanding that courage is clearest when mercy is gone. By late 1864, the war had entered its most merciless phase. Cities burned, fields lay wasted, and yet amid that ruin, one truth had become undeniable, even to the highest levels of government. The black soldier had earned his place, not by favor or politics, but through blood. Fort Pillow and the crater had made it impossible to deny. Every report from the front carried the same refrain: they fought to the last man. The question was no longer whether the United States colored troops deserved recognition. It was how far the nation was willing to go to protect them. General Ulysses S. Grant, who had once viewed the use of black regiments with cautious pragmatism, now understood that the Confederacy's no-prisoner policy required a response. In August 1864, he issued a standing order: if Confederate forces executed or enslaved any captured black soldiers, the Union would retaliate in kind. "The government is bound to afford the same protection to all its soldiers," he wrote, "and will retaliate for every violation of the laws of war." That statement was more than a policy. It was a declaration of equality. For the first time, the United States government explicitly recognized black soldiers as full combatants under the law of nations. The order transformed what had begun as a moral experiment into a matter of national honor. If one of them was killed, the entire Union would answer. Confederate generals protested. They called Grant's stance barbaric, insisting that Negro troops cannot be regarded as legitimate belligerents. But their protests rang hollow in the face of evidence: the blood-soaked fields of Fort Pillow, the charred corpses at Olustee, the mass graves after the crater. The Union's retaliation order was not cruelty, it was symmetry. For every atrocity committed, the threat of retribution now loomed over the South. The effect was immediate. Reports of mass executions declined sharply. Confederate commanders, some reluctantly, others out of fear, began taking captured black soldiers into custody rather than murdering them outright. The very policy meant to erase their humanity had forced the Confederacy to confront it. At the same time, within the Union ranks, attitudes shifted dramatically. The same generals who had once doubted the competence of the USCT began writing dispatches that sounded almost reverent. General James H. Wilson described them as steady under fire, obedient in discipline, and unsurpassed in courage. General Benjamin Butler, one of the first to organize black regiments, called them the most reliable soldiers in the Army. Even skeptical northern newspapers began printing stories of their bravery without qualification. For Lincoln, this transformation carried immense weight. In the summer of 1864, as re-election hung in doubt, he told an audience, "Without the military help of the black freedmen, the war against the rebellion could not have been won." It was the closest he ever came to acknowledging that their fight had saved his cause. But recognition came with a darker current: retribution on the battlefield. The cry, "Remember Fort Pillow," had become both vow and verdict. When black regiments went into battle, they carried that memory like a weapon. At the Battle of Nashville in December 1864, units of the 13th USCT stormed Confederate breastworks under heavy fire. They lost more than half their number in 20 minutes, but kept advancing, bayonets flashing through smoke. When they finally broke the enemy line, survivors described a kind of grim elation. One officer wrote, "They fought with a fury that was more than courage. It was vengeance. The Union command didn't discourage it." Grant and Sherman both understood that the rage of the USCT was the natural outcome of what they had endured. In official reports, their conduct was described as relentless but justified. For a war that had begun as a political crisis, it had become something rawer, older, the settling of moral debts. Even Confederate prisoners noticed the shift. One captured officer confessed after Nashville, "We used to think them beasts. Now we think them men, and dangerous ones." That admission, from the very enemy who once denied their right to exist as soldiers, was its own quiet vindication. Behind the front lines, the Union began to honor its fallen differently. Black soldiers killed in action were buried in marked graves, their headstones bearing the same rank and regiment designations as their white comrades. It was a small gesture, but symbolically immense. In the arithmetic of history, equality was finally being written in stone. By the final winter of the war, the USCT had fought in more than 400 engagements. They had taken Confederate positions, guarded supply lines, built fortifications, and stormed cities. They had suffered higher casualties than many white units, and received less pay for much of that time. But now, for the first time, they were not fighting alone. The United States itself, its generals, its president, its policy, stood behind them. Grant's retaliation order and Lincoln's words had done what battlefield valor alone could not. They made the government morally accountable to the men who fought beneath its flag. When a black soldier went into battle after that, he did so, knowing that his country finally claimed him. The Confederate threat to take no prisoners had created a monster of its own making, not of rage, but of justice. And by 1865, that justice had a face, a uniform, and a name stitched across its chest: U.S. Colored Troops. April 1865. The cannons finally fell silent. Across Virginia, campfires burned low as news spread that Lee had surrendered at Appomattox. For the white soldiers of the Union, it meant the war was over. For the black soldiers of the U.S. Colored troops, it meant something deeper, that for the first time in their lives, they were no longer fighting for freedom. They were living it. They marched into cities they had once been forbidden to enter as free men. In Charleston, South Carolina, the cradle of secession, the 21st U.S. Colored Troops paraded down Meeting Street, rifles gleaming in the sun. Freedmen lined the sidewalks, cheering and weeping. Many of them were seeing black men in uniform for the first time. A Northern correspondent wrote, "It was the conquered leading the conquerors in triumph." The symbolism was almost biblical. The very men who had been born into bondage now marched as liberators. And yet, their victory came with an ache that words could hardly contain. The war had taken nearly 40,000 black lives. Their regiments had been targets of hatred, denied equal pay, and threatened with execution if captured. But they had endured, and in doing so, they had rewritten the moral meaning of the Union cause. The final months of the war revealed just how far they had come. At Richmond, the Confederate capital, black soldiers were among the first Union troops to enter the city. They advanced through streets still smoldering from fires set by retreating rebels. Residents, some jeering, others stunned into silence, watched the spectacle they had once sworn would never happen. One officer of the 25th USCT noted, "Every bayonet lifted here is an answer to 200 years of bondage." The Confederacy's final weapon, fear, had failed. The same white officers who once hesitated to command black regiments now competed to lead them. General Charles Devens, addressing his men at the war's end, said, "You have fought the last and hardest battle of the slave. You have made your freedom a fact the world cannot deny." When the shooting stopped, the question of what came next loomed large. Many expected the disbandment of the USCT to be immediate, their service quietly forgotten. But Lincoln's assassination changed everything. The murder of the man who had signed the Emancipation Proclamation deepened the resolve to honor his soldiers. At Grand Review parades in Washington, thousands of black troops marched past the White House, their flags pierced and faded from battle. The cheers of the crowd were thunderous. Reporters noted that the applause grew louder when the USCT columns appeared. Even those who had doubted them, politicians, officers, ordinary citizens, now understood. The men they once called contraband had fought like patriots. Still, the transition to peace was uneasy. Many black veterans were warned not to remain armed when they returned south. Commanders feared retaliation from former Confederates, who saw the sight of a freed black man in uniform as a provocation. To prevent bloodshed, the Army quietly reassigned many regiments to frontier posts or garrison duty in the North. Their courage had helped win the Union, but the land they freed was not yet ready to accept them. Yet even in that injustice lay a victory. The USCT veterans carried their defiance into civilian life. Many became community leaders, ministers, educators, and politicians. Their service records, signed by Union generals and sealed with the authority of the War Department, were proof of manhood in a world still unwilling to grant it. They built schools and churches where slavery's ruins still smoked. They registered voters. They formed the backbone of Reconstruction's first experiments in democracy. The Confederate promise of extermination had failed not only militarily, but morally. The black soldiers' endurance had turned the Confederacy's threat into a national reckoning. The same nation that once debated whether a black man was property now owed its very survival to him. The legacy of defiance lingered long after the last musket was fired. It lived in the generations that followed, in the songs sung by freed families, in the stone markers that bore the initials USCT, and in the quiet pride of men who had seen the impossible and lived to march away from it. A Southern prisoner of war once wrote bitterly, "They fought us like men who had nothing to lose." He meant it as an insult. History took it as truth. They fought because the alternative was to be erased. They fought knowing that surrender meant death, but that death could also mean dignity. And when the war finally ended, they stood at its moral summit, having done what no proclamation or law could do. They proved freedom's worth in the only language tyranny understands: courage. The Confederates had vowed to take no prisoners. The black soldiers' answer echoed across the generations: "Then we will be our own deliverance." Their defiance did not end the war. It redefined it. It turned a struggle for union into a fight for humanity, and ensured that the story of the United States would forever bear their mark.